Hi, I'm Anthony Originello, CEO of the Chartered Professionals in Human Resources for BC and Yukon. We represent more than 8,000 members, and as the organization dedicated to advancing the HR profession through education, advocacy, awareness, professional development, as well as our recognized and impactful CPHR designation, we are proud to be a sponsor of this show. We have been the voice of the HR profession since 1942. Learn more about us at cphrbc.ca.
In this episode of Careers That Matter, I'm joined by Louis Dron, who is the CEO of Redwood AI. Louis, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
You are the CEO of an artificial intelligence company. What exactly does your job look like?
The job of a CEO could be highly variable. Today I'm filming with you. Earlier today I was working on a youth employment grant for some of the graduate students we have joining our team in the next few weeks. This afternoon I'll be looking at marketing materials for the company and how we're communicating some of our strategies. And later on I'll be looking at some of the AI and the data code that we've been coming into. And that's Thursday. That's fairly typical, to be honest with you. You know, change some of these other pieces around. So variable might be the one-word synopsis, yeah.
So are you on the job literally from the moment you wake up?
There is absolutely a case of that too. You know, a lot of our colleagues are based here in Vancouver and also in Stanford University, so West Coast based. But members of the team who support our group are based on the East Coast and in Europe as well. So the one added upside of the change to daylight savings is we might be an hour closer to them in the wintertime coming up. So yeah, absolutely. It's around the clock. You never know what's going to happen on a given day, right? You know, we're a young emerging company. Things are very, very fluid and dynamic. Strategies change. We're a very tight-knit group here as well. So it's a lot of activity, but it's fun.
7 days a week? Do you ever turn it off?
I turn it off when we're watching hockey and with my kid, and other than that, we try and keep in communication there too. But you know, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? That's the case with these startup companies there too. You need to go fast when you need to go fast, and you need to find the times to sort of bring it back into sort of regular pacing when you get the opportunity to do so. It's a creative industry, right? Which is an interesting thing to say about something focused on chemistry and AI, which might not jump out at people as art, but there's a lot of creativity in how you're creating your messaging. There's a lot of creativities in the coding, how you deal with chemical problems. It's through a very scientific lens, of course, there too, but you kind of need those breaks in between to chase it up a little bit too. So yes, absolutely, there's a degree of go, but there's a degree of sort of finding those balance points and working with the team on those.
So you talk about the outward-facing elements of the job, doing this, looking at what we're going to do for our marketing strategy. Then also you're dealing with the team, you're reviewing code, where you're going. But you also have other responsibilities, making sure that there's money in the bank.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of an accounting function, but I would imagine that a big part of your job is also fundraising.
Yeah, absolutely. And fundraising is really interesting because that's kind of at the intersection of everything else we just talked about here as well, right? To have a nice fundraising story when you can communicate effectively, you really do need to be tuned into all of these pieces. You know, we have some investor calls with people that, you know, never went further than high school chemistry. You know, you need to find a way to communicate with them. It's a complicated topic and one that people are generally not typically aware of. I also had an experience of talking at quite some length to an investor and I was explaining Lego blocks and cake making, and it transpired afterwards he was 20 years at Merck as the head of process chemistry and hadn't let it on there to sort of explain it at the same time. So you really need to be on top of all these other pieces. Some folks will want to learn about what's going on in your code, what's your data strategy. Some people want to know the IP side. So that's a really interesting kind of intersection that requires all of these other pieces to be in play. Whereas, you know, some of the chemistry pieces, of course, you need to think about commercialization and communication, but those can sometimes be a bit more focused tasks. The really interesting point of the sort of the entrepreneurship journey is as well when you're starting to hand things off to other people. You know, there is also a limit to how much you can do as any individual here as well. And particularly, as you mentioned, on sort of, you know, the support we got from a fantastic team and in the finance side, on the scientific side, you know, they start to build out into their own, you know, you'd call them verticals or something in a classical business sense, yeah.
So how many people report to you? Or is you just such a small team that everybody is in constant communication?
I would say it's more towards the constant communication side. Like it's a broad enough group. So sort of, you know, day to day in office, there's between sort of 6 to 8 folks that are sort of involved in, say, the core activities. But there's a much broader network of our team who sit in different spaces, right? So we've got the folks down at Stanford University in the US. We're working with sort of, local government partners and some of the academic partnerships we have coming up. So we're, working with groups on, say, quantum computing applications there too. So the broader team is actually getting to sort of 30 plus people involved in this whole process, but that core team is a sort of the day-to-day. So, you could call it like a hub and spoke type model there as well, where we're sort of in Vancouver as the sort of the hub of some of these pieces, but every single one of those elements is key to progressing. Yeah.
So as you continue to grow, you're getting into that sort of tricky transition space between startup to operating company.
Yeah, it's exactly that. We had just a recent, few conversations we're having. We're turning from, concept into contract and now into execution, and that's absolutely thrilling. It's a fantastic sign of the progress we've made and where the whole team's gotten to. And then it's that realization of, well, hold on, all that R&D we need to do here now needs to be partly, applied to this project. How are we going to balance all of these pieces out? It's the really interesting thing about being in R&D in tech and science. You've always got to be innovating, right? Like you never stop. And especially in AI, what we were doing 3 years ago, as we were starting to sketch out what this company could look like, is completely different to what we're doing today. Not that we didn't have the foresight for it, but because things have just moved so quickly in the space. So yeah, it's that sort of the seesaw moment where you're transitioning from one to the other and finding that balance it's a really exciting part of the process.
Well, because being the CEO of an AI company is so new, let's talk about how you got here. Sure. You graduate from your primary secondary school education in England, which I gather. Did you leave saying, oh yeah, I know what I want to do. I want to be the CEO of an artificial intelligence company doing chemical synthesis?
I at that level, so what's that, 16 to 18 in England, you go to what's called sixth form, and that's your kind of pre-university years. I wanted to be in theatre. I'd auditioned for Harry Potter. I had a band. There was a whole different approach going on here too. And maybe somewhat politely, my parents were saying, you like science too, yeah? You want to keep a hand in this sort of space there too. So I did the two at the same time for many years. And just the scientific side is just endlessly vast, right? And there's you can really see where people push through and they have talent and they can progress in the industry, which is not always the case, regrettably, for the entertainment industry there too. So I had to hedge my bets a little bit here too, give up on the Harry Potter dream and focus into the science side. But it's incredibly rich, and actually there's a lot of overlaps, right? We're talking now, there's a lot of the presentation side of things. So much of science is storytelling. You think of the great scientists that people hear about over time, you remember them because they're amazing orators. They can tell stories for topics that you might know nothing about. I listen to these physicists and some of these, AI scientists. I'm very far removed from their level, but you can get part of that story, and it's really inspiring in that way, yeah. So originally, no, not science at all, but as you start to see the overlaps in these pieces, the narrative becomes quite clear. It's storytelling and it's science all at once.
So you went to university.
Yeah.
What did you study?
I studied medical biochemistry to begin with. So I've always been really interested in what makes people unwell. At its core level, that's what medical biochemistry is. And how do you measure that, and how do you sort of figure out what's going on with people there too? And that's obviously directly tied to the pharmaceutical industry, right? If you don't know what's happening with someone, you can't treat them. That's the basic premise of much of this work. And there's imaging, but a lot of it is the chemistry going on in your bodies here too. When I was like 8 years old, I picked up some book and I kept on calling it Microbies because it had these amazing pictures in there too, which I didn't understand at the time. But there are these pictures of these cells, and it's just this staggering concept that you have 10 to the whatever number of cells in your body all activating at the same time. The number of reactions happening, for you and I right now, everyone watching this, is unfathomably large. Even for our AI models at the moment, they're unable to model all of these pieces. And it was just absolutely staggering. Like something that you can express in chemical formulas is partly how we experience the world, which gets very philosophical and crazy.
But you were getting excited about it.
Yeah, well, it was more exciting than it was daunting at the time. And so I continued on that. When I finished my undergraduate education, I went to work in the health service in the UK. So there's a medical role called a clinical biochemist, and you're kind of working on the interpretation of lab results. So now you're kind of moving a little bit away from the core, just, okay, what are the nuts and bolts of chemistry, to well, what does it mean when you start to put it all together? We're dealing with systems, with human health. We're dealing with, analyzer problems there too. It's the interface of all these things. You leave a sample on the shelf for a little while, there's going to be chemical changes to it. That can look like a serious illness if you're not familiar with all these other pieces. So, I spent some number of years in the health service in England, at the Royal Free Hospital, it's UCL Partners, learning, boots on the ground, what happens to people in hospitals. I remember my first day there was, a real shocking experience. There's 300 blood samples, and it's from, a clinic of people who have HIV, for example. And it was that first sort of interface with like the scale of medicine. You have personal stories, you have, friends, family, sadly, who have illnesses, and then you start to see the scale of some of these things in practice. And that was a real, I've learned about this for years. Each one of those blood samples is a human with a story and a family and everything else. And it was this really staggering moment of the scale of the problem there too. So it was a real eye-opener.
So what was the next progression in your career? How long did you do that work? And then where'd you go?
Yeah, so that was, I think, 4 or 5 years in England. So after education, I was one of the few folks who didn't have a PhD on that program. So, they get 20,000 applicants for it. They bring on 100 people a year. It was myself and 2 or 3 others who didn't have a PhD that got into that program for the first time. So relatively young to start off on that process there too. There's a funny picture of me with my hospital badge and still a bad sort of beard, which is, I don't know if it's improved so much now, but it's on its way at least there. But to that point about those individuals and those stories, you see those 300 blood samples, you see the individual pieces. As a clinical biochemist, you can help individuals and you can help at scale, and it's absolutely a part of human health. But to make a really big impact on thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives, that sort of hand-on delivery piece can be a little bit challenging there too. You can't get such a big impact. At the same time, my wife and I, we were interested in moving to somewhere else, just for a year or so. We'd done our education, we both worked in London in the healthcare service. We thought, try somewhere else out for a year. My parents are here in Vancouver, and originally 1 year work visa, come and work for this company. This company was focused on how do you analyze clinical trial data. And as mentioned, there's no going back from Vancouver once you've come here for a year. It was really just the stunning experience. The team, who is actually now, this is a funny one, that company was called Redwood Outcomes. So this was a company focused on, clinical data, outcomes research. How do you look at thousands and thousands of patient data in clinical trials and work out which medicines are working the best? And that was really exciting seeing that kind of startup culture. 2 of the founders of that company, Ed Mills and Christian Thorland, are now part of Redwood AI here too. So we've worked with each other now for 10 years. These amazing mentors in this space. How do you build a company from, that group was 2 people, they got up to 50 people, they sold to a US-based company, an enormous success. How do you build that story too? So that's that sort of business building piece that I started to get experience with there as well. So as mentioned, it was supposed to be just for a couple of years. With 10 years in now, my kids here down at school where I first saw, near Granville Island, all of these pieces too. We then, once that company was sold to the US-based group, we started up another company. And now we're talking about global health. We're talking about patient data. How can you compare and get the most out of the routine patient data we all collect? And a big part of that work was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation here too. So sort of getting access to, how are you scaling up? How are you getting these problems solved for, significant numbers of populations of folks there at the same time? And that was, again, a success. There was 3 of us in that office to start off with. We got up to maybe 15 to 20 people, and it was sold to another US-based company who's one of the biggest players in the space, called Cytel there as well. And so that was really the beginning. I was heading up these data science teams, and we're dealing with human health data at scale. We're dealing with, at the time, what we were calling machine learning, right? Technologies, these ideas of, throwing a vast amount of data at these models and seeing what they can achieve. So the move sounds a little bit, I was telling you, when we spoke ahead of this, about a shaggy dog story, right? Theater and music into, specific lab chemistry into, CEO of AI. There's a sort of a narrative between these pieces. What's the scale of the problem you can handle and how do you go about solving it?
What have you discovered or learned about yourself that has been instrumental in your success?
Yeah, that's a tough question. There's a lot of things I've learned about myself over these years, and I think particularly when you're dealing with these sort of, my parallel is this, in the NHS, I don't know how many million employees they have. You as a role, you got to be focused on day in, day out, of course, but you're 1 out of a million, right? The services are set up in such a way where people are fairly replaceable in all of these instances too. When you're going now to a startup, there's 5 of you in the group. The effort and the work that you put in as an individual, you can see it immediately come out here, right? You can see the impact. Now there's this new analysis, now there's this new technology, now there's this new interview on TV here for careers and everything else there as well. And so I think that sort of understanding that's what's rewarding to me is seeing impact, right? Like you're always impacting whatever you're doing, any job around the world, right? Absolutely, day in, day out. But having that sort of feedback cycle there too, being able to see the impact, being able to bring people together, I think is really fun. So that was a piece I hadn't anticipated. I actually didn't care for math when I was doing 16, 17. But now you can start to see how it fits into these teams, communicating with these folks who have spent 20 plus years, just thinking about deep mathematics and starting to learn some of those stories and how it all blends together. Like that blending of a bunch of different, practice areas is really, I think, where I'm at my strongest there too. It's we're speaking to finance folks, data scientists, chemists, accountants, everyone else in between here too, quantum scientists now, unbelievably, trying to find, what's the thread that connects these stories all together. So I think it comes back to storytelling in a way, interestingly.
Interestingly, I think that you are right. Thanks for giving us a glimpse into your job and the career path that brought you to it.